Hello and welcome to Japan Expert Insights and our discussion series on geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific and Japan's role in the region. Every second Monday, Dr. Stephen Nagy, Senior Associate Professor at the Department of Politics and International Studies at the International Christian University in Tokyo, and host Maya Matsuoka host a discussion on the latest developments, new challenges, and shifts in the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific region. In this podcast, we welcome comments, questions, and opinions, so if you haven't done so yet, join us next time. In the meantime, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel, where we upload audio episodes on the Japanese politics, business insights, and the Japan's role in the Indo-Pacific region. Today, the points which Stephen is going to talk about are trade, partnerships, digitalization, the importance of building resilient supply chains, and the digital economy in the Indo-Pacific region.
I think all of us understand that this region is home to the three most populous countries, India, China, and Indonesia. It is the home to the most dynamic economies, frankly, whether that's the Northeast Asian economies, the Southeast Asian economies, or South Asia. This is where most of the middle classes are going to emerge from in the world in the next 10 to 15 years. And those middle class consumers are going to be interested in consuming everything from the agricultural products that come out of Australia and Canada to the high-tech goods that are produced in many countries. They will be the driver of growth. And as a result, it's really important to look at the Indo-Pacific's broader trajectory. What kinds of trade agreements are occurring here, and what do they say about how countries within the Indo-Pacific view each other? So I think that there's a few big trade agreements that we should focus on. The first one is the so-called Comprehensive, Progressive, Trans-Pacific Partnership. So this particular agreement was initially between 4 countries in Southeast Asia, and it was basically expanded to include 12 countries, including the United States. As we all know, when the former president of the United States, President Trump, came into power, he decided to withdraw the United States from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But Prime Minister Abe, the former Prime Minister of Japan, really took a leadership role and spearheaded the signing of the Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. So I'll call it the TPP-11. So what are some of the key characteristics of the TPP-11? Well, one is it protects intellectual property rights. 2, it has strong environmental law protection. 3, it has strong labor law protection. And lastly, it limits the role of state-owned enterprises. Now, there's some other chapters in there that we'll come back to, but those 4 elements are really, really important. Protecting intellectual property rights means that you're protecting the investments of businesses to promote development and innovation and an entrepreneurial economy. And that's really, really critical if you want to produce new technologies and new industries and new businesses to really bring dynamism to your economy. The labor law and the environmental law is to ensure that countries with lower labor standards or that are not cautious about the environment really can't take advantage of those characteristics to outcompete other countries. So that's really critical when we're thinking about letting market forces dictate how economies work with each other, is that countries that can exploit huge amounts of labor can really create unfair playing ground for businesses. And then lastly, this idea of limiting the role of state-owned enterprises. Some countries in the region, in particular China, have huge state-owned enterprises, and those state-owned enterprises can divert resources to their sector, which warps how market forces are playing out, and really it creates unfair competition. So the TPP-11 was really forged to ensure that market forces and intellectual property rights really create the conditions for the next kind of economy. So the TPP-11 is really critical for the Indo-Pacific, and if you look at the countries that are part of the so-called TPP-11, they range from Mexico to Canada to Japan to Australia, New Zealand, Vietnam, Brunei, Malaysia, and others. So it's really a wide-spanning trade agreement, and it's likely going to include the UK in the future, and most likely other countries as well. Now, the second big trade agreement that I think is important is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. Now, this trade agreement is really with the ASEAN plus 6 countries. except for India. India's decided not to be part of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, and we can talk about some of the reasons behind that. But this Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership is really about lower value trade. It puts ASEAN centrality, or ASEAN in the center of the trade agreement, that all ASEAN countries really are the benefactors and all trade goes through ASEAN. And this particular agreement includes some really interesting combinations. So Australia's in it, New Zealand's in it, Japan's in it, China's in it, Southeast Asian countries are in it. And what this suggests is that countries that have real challenges in their bilateral relationship with China are not seeing the relationship simply through a zero-sum agreement, that they're still engaging in as much trade as possible with China. And the idea here is to try and shape the rules of the road for the Indo-Pacific region, a region that really doesn't have strong institutions or a strong trading regime that's going to shape how the region trades and how it evolves moving forward. So both the TPP-11 and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP, really are meant to provide the framework for institution building and rules-based trade within the region. Now, you're probably asking next, then, can countries like Taiwan and China, can countries like China and political entities like Taiwan join the TPP? And this is a really interesting question, and I think that Taiwan most likely has already done all the preparations to join the TPP-11. And its accession to the PPP-11 will be a political choice, or will be a political abstention by some countries within the current TPP, because all members have to agree to new members. China, on the other hand, as I mentioned earlier, with its strong state-owned enterprises, it's unlikely that it would be accepted to the TPP just based on its state-owned enterprises. But not only that, I think that there are challenges to its accession in terms of some of the partners within the current TPP because of political differences. So this is an important agreement, and it's helping shape the dynamics of the Indo-Pacific region as well. A third discussion that's emerging is the so-called U.S. support for what they call an Indo-Pacific framework, which is flexible and inclusive. And the U.S. is, under the Biden administration, is advocating for some kind of a framework that will focus on supply chains, the digital economy, and infrastructure. And they're using these key ideas of flexible and inclusive. And the idea is to focus on the issues that the region is facing, perhaps focusing on the strengths of the United States and its existing partners. And third, focus on the areas important for the United States and its partners in terms of outcompeting the economic muscle of China. And that means building those supply chains throughout the region, selectively diversifying those supply chains throughout the region, building the regulation and regulatory structure for the digital economy, and again, building infrastructure connectivity throughout the region in a way that is based on fiscal transparency, environmental sustainability, free of geopolitical interests, and lastly, some kind of sustainability within the infrastructure. Now, why has this become a focus for the Biden administration in pursuing this so-called Indo-Pacific framework? It's that there's a real realization in Washington that it was a strategic bundle to step away from the TPP-11 by the former administration. But that being said, there's no support within the United States for domestically for engaging in free trade agreements such as the TPP-11. Not so much because of the empirical data says it's bad for the United States, but the mood domestically in the United States is not one of free trade overtly. Rather, it's a mood of politicizing trade. So these three trade agreements, I think, are really, really important for us to be thinking about. But we should also be thinking about this idea of resilient supply chains and this idea of a digital economy. So the resilient supply chains initiatives that are coming out through the Indo-Pacific region really are about dealing with three different elements. One is the geopolitical tensions that are occurring between the United States and China and how this impacts supply chains and the flow of goods. Two, dealing with black swan events, and the COVID-19 was a real example of how a black swan event could totally disrupt. It's like the COVID-19 really means that we need to start ensuring that we have many supply chain hubs. And the supply chain hubs are not so much worried about a problem in one country, but trying to diversify where the supply chains are based to ensure that if there's a problem in one hub, that the other hubs can take on um, that that need. The third thing that's I think pushing countries to develop in resilient supply chains is really thinking about the costs and the challenges to another disruption in supply chains, whether it's COVID-19 or a natural disaster, that any of these can affect the supply of goods throughout the region and can affect economic stability and as a result affect political stability. And this is something that all the economies within the region are interested in preventing. So resilient supply chains is really, really something that we're seeing become a really critical part of how we're thinking about the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific. Lastly is this idea of the digital economy. So I think for many of us, the digital economy might be something that we're not quite sure about. But if you use Line or you use WeChat, or growingly if you use things like PayPay in Japan or PayPal, these are all forms of digital commerce where we cut out the middleman, and it allows us to decrease the cost of our financial engagements, increases the speed of our financial engagements, and allows us to engage in trade and commerce in a very, very effective, fast, and in some ways unregulated manner. And this is an area that I think many countries are trying to find a way to regulate the digital economy so that they can protect privacy, so they can monitor the kinds of commerce that's going on, so they can, of course, benefit from the commerce through either taxation or other forms of engagement. But it's all about trying to ensure that how the digital economy evolves moving forward is based on transparent rules-based process that's in line with the interests of countries within the region. Now, this particular issue is quite challenging in that we see countries like China and Russia really focusing on cyber sovereignty, developing their own rules of how cyber commerce should work. And that cyber commerce is functioning based on the political demands and the political interests of those two states. And in some ways, there's issues of privacy, localization of data, and in general, concerns about how the state could use one's digital footprint, not so much in the interest of the individual, but in the interest of the state. So right now, there's a growing discussions within the Indo-Pacific stakeholder realm of how to best regulate the digital economy such that we are protecting the rights of our consumers. We are protecting the privacy of our consumers, and we're ensuring that any kind of use of the data that's found in the digital economy is not exploited by governments within the region. And this is something that is becoming a real challenge for Indo-Pacific stakeholders, because on the one hand, I think China is providing a digital economy and digital infrastructure that is fast, reliable, profitable, but potentially open to privacy issues. And that this puts those states at a bit of a disadvantage if there is a political issue at hand. On the other side is the digital economy that's been being promoted by, I guess, traditional Western powers, so that includes Japan, that is more rules-based, transparent, protects privacy. And this is a very imperfect system, and it's a discussion that is moving forward. So just in summary, when we're thinking about the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific and we're thinking about trade, the digital economy, again, I encourage you to think about the Trans-Pacific Partnership 11, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership that I mentioned, which is really an inclusive agreement. More and more, we need to think about the U.S.'s Indo-Pacific framework that it's advocating. We need to think about resilient supply chains and why supply chains have become a really critical area of discussion within the region. And lastly, we need to think about the future of the digital economy, how it will be regulated, how will we protect our privacy, how will governments use our data for the purpose of governing or the purpose of control or the purpose of making profits. And these are all areas to be thinking about within the Indo-Pacific.
I have a few questions which came to me via the back channel. Before I read them to you, I just wondered, you mentioned that one of the challenges is building infrastructure throughout the region, and that should be, let's say, financed transparently and also free of geopolitical interests. But to me, it sounds a little bit like an oxymoron, because obviously countries are investing in infrastructure which serves their geopolitical interests first. So how do you think that a conflict of interest can be resolved, or can it be at all?
So I think what we've seen in the past is that, and one of the early investors in infrastructure in Southeast Asia was Japan. In the 60s, Japan invested a lot of overseas development assistance into Southeast Asia, and the primary purpose was to help build the economies, to be able to exploit the resources there, and bring those back to Japan and build the Japanese economy. So I think the first 10 years of Japanese development was quite insensitive, and Japan received the reputation for being a so-called economic animal that would exploit the resources in Southeast Asia. But today, I think that view is very, very different. Japan learned from its experiences. Today, it has kind of the gold standard in terms of investing in infrastructure connectivity in Southeast Asia and South Asia, and it's generally seen to be pretty transparent, very, very detailed-oriented, almost to obsessive level. And to be one that's long-standing, sustainable, and based on relationships. Of course, it's a mutually beneficial relationship. Japan benefits from the investments in the Indo-Pacific, and so do the countries. What is Japan's broader interests? Of course, it wants to have access to markets. It wants to help build institutions. It wants those countries to have look at Japan in a good light, and that's something that is not completely altruistic. But what we've seen over the past 10, 20, 30 years is Japan's aid has been mostly transparent, mostly rules-based, mostly environmentally friendly. And that continues to be kind of the principles by which Japan is engaging in the region. Now, the other big player within the region, actually there's two, Korea and China. Korea followed a very similar path to the Japanese, and the volume of their infrastructure connectivity assistance is not as much as the Japanese, but again, I think they've learned similar lessons. And our Chinese friends really have started their journey in terms of the provision of infrastructure connectivity through the Belt Road Initiative, beginning before 2017. But with the advent of the Belt Road Initiative, we've seen an acceleration of that aid. So I think the initial criticisms of the Chinese initiatives have been that they were not fiscally sustainable, they weren't environmentally friendly, that there was geopolitical ties, and they weren't sustainable. And what we've seen is our Chinese friends start to change that and try to improve their infrastructure connectivity such that they can't be labeled with those, criticisms again. So have they been successful? Well, at this stage, we don't know. I think it really depends on which part of the country, the world you go to. In general, in developing states in Africa, the BRI investments are seen in a much better light than, for example, in China's own backyard in Southeast Asia or other parts of its backyard.
Yes, it's interesting to watch what happens, because only recently there was some news about China and how China invested in building the airport, which is another piece of infrastructure in an African country, and then there was a kind of once again a conflict of interest there as well. So it's good to see and good to hear from you that things are changing, and hopefully China will be transparent here in the region as well.
It's definitely moving that way, and I think that we should be very cautious when we criticize China's initiatives in terms of infrastructure connectivity and put them in the broader context and look at not just how its immediate periphery might see these, but look at African states or South Central Asian states who have much better views about Chinese investment.
Right. Yes. That's good to know. And yes, as you say, we always should think of, well, not just in the short term, but in the long term as well. And obviously, China is one of the major players in the region here, and the country can invest.
I see Raymond Lau on the call or in the room.
Yes.
He is someone that does work on Africa. He might be able to shed some light. Well, I'll wait for him to come back, and if he wants to step up into the room.
Ren, if you would like to join us, please do.
Yes, hi. I'm in a noisy place, so I hope I'm not going to cause too much problem. But thank you again for a very insightful information, Stefan and Maya. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, no problem.
Okay, good. Just a quick question. Maybe because I'm too young, I was not aware the Japanese investment in the Asian nations were initially not so positively viewed. I'm curious to know what did they do before they became more before Japan became a more rule-based, respected investment country, developing country.
All right, Ren, that's a great question. So I think as Japan was rebuilding its economy, during the 1950s and 60s. It needed to go out and get natural resources, and it went to countries in Southeast Asia, whether it was the Philippines or Indonesia or other countries in Southeast Asia, and it logged those countries, and it got those natural resources without thinking so much about some of the environmental issues at the time. And I think part of this was a lack of awareness of how integrated the environment is and what are the consequences in one area, or how damage in one area can affect others. I think part of it was just driven by profit, and part of it was driven by poverty. The countries in Southeast Asia needed capital, and one of the best ways to do it was for them to sell their natural resources to Japan. So I don't want to put the blame all on Japan, but my point is that their initial engagement in commerce and infrastructure and connectivity within Southeast Asia was somewhat problematic, and they did a course correction. And as I mentioned, if you look at surveys such as the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, they consistently look at Japan as a country that has a good reputation, that's trusted, and I think it's trusted and has a good reputation because of that long-term investment.
I see. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, and the other more recent topic involving, I think you mentioned Japan, Korea, and China. For example, the case in point example is Indonesia. In Japan, I mean, I'm speaking from most of my Japanese friends' view, that Japan had initially helped Indonesia to build the high-speed railroad. All these investigations, the initial investment, at the end, China kind of snubbed it with a very low bidding, and there's a pretty sad and hard feeling toward the way the Chinese way of taking away whatever Japan made an effort for years. Do you think there's fairness in that kind of assessment of China coming in late and took away what Japan did for that country in early years?
So I think the background here, for not everybody may know that Japan was scheduled to build some light rail transit in Indonesia, and the contract was eventually won by a Chinese company. So I think the decision was by the Indonesians to allow the Chinese to build it was speed, and it was probably tide aid and better conditions. I think one of the challenges for Japanese overseas development aid, and when they're engaged in infrastructure activity, does have to do with speed and scale and cost. And the Chinese, because of their overcapacity and because of the cheap labor, that they can do things at a much quicker and a cheaper level. And I think that this was more about the cost and less about a snub of Japan in general. So I think we should be cautious there, that this was competing prices and products. And I tell this story of my last trip to Kathmandu. My Kathmandu counterparts, they said, look at that road over there, and it was a road of I think it was a 4-lane road or a 5-lane road, and they said the Chinese built this in 3 months, and it was really quick. And then they said, you see that little road over there, and they said the Japanese built this, but it took 2 years, and it's half the size. So I think that going back to my point, this is cost, speed, and efficiency, and I think in some the Chinese can do it better than the Japanese.
Right. Maybe this is a good point, a good place to talk about the bigger issue that you have been talking about. This Indonesia issue. Later, I'm sure you have followed the news that Indonesia found out that some of the promises that the Chinese made to them to win the contract away from Japan a lot of them were false promises. For example, the safety issues and all those issues. The Indonesian government is now, or maybe may have already decided to scrap the deal with China and now going back to Japan. I don't know what the latest situation is, but this kind of things shouldn't surprise us when somebody wants to show off, if you will, the speed and the cost, but end up not able to deliver that. It happens in business all the time. And do you think this TPP or whatever the international organization that is trying to solve some of this irregularity will help make the playing field more fair, transparent? and helpful to everybody. Because if somebody decided to go with another person and end up going back to the first person, that's a waste of time and money for, especially for developing country that is not always cash rich, right?
Well, it does create problems in terms of credibility of the recipient country then, and I think that Japan will be more cautious moving forward as they see what happened in with their last experience with Indonesia. Notwithstanding, I think that Japan really prioritizes Southeast Asian countries. We see that with Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific vision, where it says that ASEAN centrality and Southeast Asian countries are a clear priority for Japan. And we saw that with the last Prime Minister Suga. His first visit abroad was to Indonesia and Vietnam. We just had a visit of the Vietnamese premier to Tokyo last week. And this is all, I think, strong signs that Japan really prioritizes these two countries. So I think that Japan will get over it. I think its priority is building long-standing trust-based relations with Southeast Asian countries, in particular the Southeast Asian giants of Indonesia and Vietnam.
Yeah. Stephen,
Yes?
just if I can chime in, Hiroaki
Yes?
came up on stage and he has a few questions, and he
Sure.
has to leave in about 10 minutes. So, Raymond, I'm sorry for keeping you waiting. Let's give the word to Hiroaki first. Hiroaki?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, Hiro.
Good. It is a very great discussion going on, so I'm very happy to hear how we can make a orderly relationship of the in Indo-Pacific countries. My question is CTTP, sorry, CTPPT, sorry. So, because many people wondering U.S. participation, Chinese, also Taiwan, their participation in this orderly relationship in the economic affairs in the Indo-Pacific. So it is desirable, perhaps for Japan and some democratic countries, accelerating or facilitating their participation in the CCTPP. So I'm wondering if it is possible to push the three countries concerned like U.S., China, Taiwan to join the CCTPP at the same timing. I think this is very good idea for me to incentivize them, or maybe we can generate a good competitions in joining the international order or making the international the Indo-Pacific economic order more proactively, more constructively. Because if we think about China first, or Taiwan first, or US first, or last, or this is create the confusion or chaos in making the stable or order relationship in the Indo-Pacific, especially economic affairs. So that's why I'm asking maybe other people have an idea how we can achieve kind of soft landing of three major parties of concern in this area, leading to this stable economic relationship in the Pacific. That is my question, but because this seminar seems like economic affair in the Pacific only, but so I'm very much hesitant to ask. But if they continue the discussion of the security affairs, if NEGI's other people have an idea how we can, strategically stabilize the U.S.-China competition with so-called guardrail measures. I think guardrail measure, one possibility is I already said INF, rebuilding the INF treaty, which includes China, is good one. But of course, many people have a question like how we can do that, and how we can especially incentivize China on the arms control, and also like kind of guardrail measures as well. What kind of guardrail measures can be possibly established between among or U.S., China, or stakeholder in the Pacific, including Japan or maybe Canada as well. So, yeah, this is my question. If you can show us some ideas, then I highly appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Hiroaki. So I think if I understood your questions correctly, you had maybe three questions. The first was how to engage in trade and focusing on China, Taiwan in the TPP-11. The second question was thinking about how to stabilize U.S.-China relations, either through trade or through a security cooperation. Are those the three questions that I got?
Yeah. In the trade, maybe U.S.-China-Taiwan relationship.
So I think that as we move forward and we're thinking about the TPP-11, and we're thinking about what is the direction, who will be the new members. So at this stage, I think the UK is likely the newest member going to be involved in the TPP. It's undergoing the negotiations right now, and it's going to most likely accede to the agreement. So the next question is, can China and Taiwan join at the same time? Well, I think that is a real possibility. The question is what do the stakeholders, what do the current TPP members think about these issues? So I think, for example, Australia and Canada and Japan would probably not feel comfortable with China joining the TPP because of political issues. And I think they feel that China has not developed its economy broadly to meet the criteria of the TPP, in particular state-owned enterprises and intellectual property theft. Taiwan, on the other hand, I think that they would. I think all the countries within the TPP-11 see Taiwan as a political entity that can join. However, I think that Vietnam, Singapore, Brunei, Malaysia will probably get pressure from China to not accept Taiwan's application. So I think that the division is already exists, and it's less about Japan and more about, I think, the China's interest in stopping Taiwan from joining the TPP. If Taiwan joins the TPP before China, it creates a problem in terms of the one China policy, and I think that this is something that China does not want to see. The second question, can this agreement be used to stabilize relations between China and the United States? I think eventually, yes. But at this particular stage, I think that the direction of U.S.-China relations is going to continue to become more negative over the next year, 2, 3, 4, or 5. And this will depend on the weakness and the strength of how China understands itself, and the weakness of and the strength of the United States. If China continues to weaken, it may relax its policies and may become more reform-oriented. If China feels it's very strong, then it may become more difficult to deal with, and that makes trade probably not the platform what they can work with. On the other hand, if the United States becomes more divided or weaker, this will create challenges in terms of the United States' ability to lead a trade agreement. If the United States becomes stronger and more confident in its international role and international leadership, then it would probably feel comfortable about leading a new trade agreement. But this is a very interactive puzzle that I think it's difficult for us to understand right now. But the third part of your question was, where can we inculcate or where can we build stability into the relationship? Well, I think one area is both countries should support their students studying in each other's countries. So I've studied in, of course, Japan, but I spent significant time in many other countries in the region, including China and Hong Kong. And I studied their languages, and it's giving me insight in terms of how the societies work, their political systems, and the values. I think to stabilize relations, we need to have more people to understand China and more people to understand the United States, and think about building long-term understandings based on actual experience in each other's countries.
Thank you, Nagi. Yeah, very comprehensive.
My pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe I have to leave, unfortunately, but I hope we can continue our discussion lively.
I look forward to it. All right.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Please take care, Hiroaki.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, Raymond, I'm sorry for keeping you waiting.
Hey, hello.
Hello.
Hi, Raymond. Good to see
Am I
you.
audible to you all?
Yes.
Hey, hello, Stephen and Maya. Yeah, good to see you.
Good to hear from
And
you.
thank you very much for inviting me to this very timely and important discussion. Yeah, and my apologies, but actually this is my very first time using this Clubhouse app, so I was encountering some technical issues when trying to log in.
Welcome to the Clubhouse family.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I don't mean to steal the spotlight for today's event, given that I am just a newcomer to this issue topic of the Indo-Pacific. Yeah, so instead of sharing my view, perhaps okay, if I can also ask a question relating to the CPTPP. So Stephen, you have just mentioned about China's application, right? I mean, China was trying to submit an application along with Taiwan to the CPTPP.
Yep.
So perhaps, in your opinion, so what has motivated Beijing to join this CPTPP thing? And because also my other question is, if China's application to the CPTPP is successful, can the CPTPP change China, or the other way around, like the CPTPP will be changed by China? Yeah, so that's basically my questions. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Raymond. So I think your question raises two important points. So the motivations behind China's application for the
Right, thank you.
CTPP, and second is regarding what is the purpose of joining. So I think in terms of motivations internationally, as I mentioned, I think that China understands that by applying to the TPP that it can block or prevent Taiwan from potentially being part of the TPP. And that's really critical to, I think, how China understands its one China policy, that Taiwan shouldn't be able to join international organizations or international trade agreements without the acceptance of China. And I think that its application is clear that it wants to block Taiwan's accession to the TPP, because I think it understands that Taiwan's, in terms of its economic development, in terms of state-owned enterprises, in terms of environmental law, labor law, and intellectual property rights protection, that Taiwan meets the standards of the TPP. The question is, will the members accept Taiwan, and will they risk the chance that China will retaliate against them if they accept Taiwan's application? At this stage, I can't tell you what the reading is. I hear many different messages in different capitals, but I think that many would like to see Taiwan join, but they understand there's consequences. So the next question is really interesting. Well, if China was to join, would China change the TPP-11, or would the TPP-11 change China? So I've heard quite a few arguments in China, and I think the economists there, they understand that the Chinese economy continues to need to reform and open up, that it needs to have stronger labor standards, it needs to have stronger environmental standards, that state-owned enterprises are a problem for the economy in terms of long-term growth, and that if it really wants to become a stronger, more dynamic and innovative economy, that it needs to really protect intellectual property rights, right? And at this stage, it's not as good as it could be. And I think that my Chinese colleagues say this, that the TPP could be a springboard or pressure to push China and Chinese development into a different direction. So that is one view. Another view is that that China could hijack the TPP-11 and then, in effect, make it not effective, and doing that by joining it but not really enforcing the TPP standards domestically. So we really don't know moving forward, but I guess my view is that countries like Japan could possibly use the opportunity to at least discuss China and Taiwan's accession to the TPP as leverage to bring the United States back into the region, and to try and get the United States to either join the TPP-11 or to finalize another or create another trade agreement such as the Indo-Pacific framework. Will that happen or not? At this stage, I just don't know.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. Yes,
You're welcome.
Very insightful analysis.
Thank you for the question. It's a good one.
Stephen, I also wonder, whether we're talking about, the digital economy. You mentioned that, in China, obviously there is this tendency towards private information, and how the Chinese digital economy is actually open to losing that privacy, or probably, just having it violated by different market players. So I wonder, because basically it is important to have regulations and to ensure that there is transparency, and that the private information of everybody who is there online on the web is protected. But do you think that these are cultural differences which can't be overcome?
So I think when we're talking about the digital economy, we're talking about digital footprints. I think that
Yes.
there's a few different levels of this discussion. First is, how do governments or businesses data that they gather? So, we're using Clubhouse, or you probably use Facebook or LinkedIn. Well, those businesses, they use our digital footprint to advertise and to make money from us, right?
Yes.
So although we're private, they're still using our digital footprint to monetize our information for their benefit. So that is the model, I think, in Western societies in general. Our European friends have tried to regulate this and to enhance the privacy side of using the internet. And if you go to any European site, you'll always be asked if you accept cookies or if you accept their terms of use.
Indeed, yes.
And this is related to the Europeans really trying to regulate how businesses are using our data. In the Chinese context, well, the state is collecting the data to, I think, for a lot of different reasons. One is to improve its digital economy, to help refine the digital economy, to get a better sense of what citizens are doing. Another way they're using this digital economy and how people use their digital footprint is to give social credit scores to citizens. So the question is do Chinese citizens mind this? Well, I think there's lots of views. If you do have time, there's a great documentary called The Digital Dictatorship that was done by the foreign correspondent out of Australia. And, this correspondent interviewed many Chinese people, and some people felt very comfortable with their data being used by the state. They felt that it made society more fair. They felt that everybody had to be transparent, and that they would get points by having the right digital footprint, kind of like a credit score. Others were not so happy about it. They felt that it invaded their privacy, and still others were accidentally penalized because of this use of the social credit to affect people's ability to travel even within the country. So there's lots of views about it. But in general, I think that the Chinese citizens feel pretty comfortable with it. Right. Most are apolitical. They see the benefits of the digital economy and using everything, are paying for everything, doing all their interactions through, in this case, the WeChat system, because it facilitates life immensely. So it's not all negative, and I think that for the ordinary Chinese that is not political, they don't really care.
That's a great point, because we in the Western world, and of course here in Japan, we're really apprehensive about how the governments use our data, how the businesses use our data. Maybe it could be too much, I don't know. But yeah, let's see how things develop. It's interesting to watch, and if China has found the balance.
Well, I think different societies will probably develop a different understanding of data privacy.
Okay.
And as I mentioned, our European friends, they have their view. Japan is actually pretty strict about data privacy.
Yeah.
But I think that one of the differences is, again, societies that generally have a separation of the political system and the legal system have better track records of transparency and rule of law. And it makes it more difficult to use the data in a good or bad way of citizens. Where you have societies that aren't like that, that don't have a strong distinction between the political system and the legal system, that it creates real contradictions and challenges about how data could potentially be used by the state to affect decisions within a business or to affect society. And this is something that I think Western societies are probably not comfortable doing, where authoritarian China is. And this goes back to the point of what the Indo-Pacific region in general would like to see, what kinds of digital environment and cybersecurity would they like to see evolve. And this is an open question, right?
Yes.
What does Indonesians want? What does 400 million Indonesians want? What does 1.4 billion Indians want? What does 125 million Japanese want? It's not so clear cut, right?
Right.
But what's clear is that without having rules to the road, the driving on the road becomes really hectic.
I understand that. Yes, indeed. And well, I've got a couple of questions via the back channel once again. So one of them, the first one is looking at the European Union and how the UK left the Union. Also, some countries are seemingly wishing to leave as well. So how can TPP, can learn from them? So this is the first question.
Okay, that's a really interesting question. So, what can other countries learn from the TPP? So, I think that
Sorry, Stephen, it's the other
yeah.
way around. What can the countries in the TPP learn from the European Union so that countries, some of the countries that are in the TPP, do not decide to leave?
Well, I think that they need to be very clear about educating their publics about the benefits of that trade agreement or that relationship. And I think that they also need to ensure that they create protective mechanisms that can ensure that people with our countries and citizens within the TPP, are not susceptible to misinformation. The choice to leave the UK, I think most evidence is very, very clear that it was highly influenced by disinformation from our Russian friends, and it created now a country that's less prosperous, and it doesn't have the same access to the EU as it could have had. Whether that's a net gain in the long term, I don't see any studies that say that the UK is going to be better off in 10 to 15 years outside the EU. But that being said, I think good communication, talking about the benefits of the TPP, expanding the number of members, and again, politicians and leaders need to continue to explain to their public, what is the tangible benefit of these agreements. And this is not always so easy because there's sometimes a trickle-down effect, right? That,
Right. Yes.
a big business that creates some high-tech product through development of new intellectual property, that will take some time for it to generate its economic ends, and that just takes time. But again, I think political leaders need to take advantage of that. Also, I think that the jobs being created through the TPP 11, if they are more service sector, higher skill based, then the governments of the members need to make sure that they're upskilling and training their population, so you don't have a group that loses out because of these trade agreements. And I think that's what we saw in the United States, and that's one of the reasons why it pulled out. I think that's what we saw in the UK, and one of the reasons why the UK looked towards Brexit as an answer to some of their social woes. But I don't think their social woes were related to trade. I think they were related to government policies of not upskilling upskilling workers so that they could get new jobs.
One more question we've got. So it's about privacy issues. So since the EU, the European Union, has strong laws protecting privacy, a lot of privacy startups are having hard time, and many of them struggle to survive. So, but privacy and data ownership is important. What or how can we learn from them? Once again, from the European Union, because obviously they have strong protection laws, but at the same time, the startups there struggle. So, is there any lesson we can learn from that?
Well, I think most studies really continue to show that the European Union has some really smart regulations, but it's also overly regulated, and that overregulation creates challenges in terms of innovation and entrepreneurship. And that needs to probably change. And the question is how do the governments find the right formula where they support innovation and risk-taking within the economy, while at the same time they create a space where people can make a mistake or lose their job or lose their finances, but still get back into the economy. And I think this has to do with deregulating the labor sector, creating more opportunities for vertical and horizontal mobility within the labor sector. And this is something that not only the European Union is not very good at, but neither is Japan or South Korea. Lifetime employment and those employment systems where people are part of the same organization for decades creates a real aversion to risk, a real aversion to startups. And governments need to find ways to support those startup systems. What is the correct formula? Well, I think it'll depend on the country. Singapore, works really closely with universities and the government and the private sector to identify sectors that are, I think they feel is the future economy of Singapore. And then the government provides training to citizens so that they can fill those positions. Canada has a different format where they try to create innovative, entrepreneurial and innovative clusters. So I think that you have to look at the various examples, look at best practices, and see if some of those best practices can be localized to really create the kind of entrepreneurship and innovativeness in the digital sector that's needed.
Ren just sent me a link.
Luke McDonald has a question. Hey, Luke, welcome.
Hey, Stephen. Really great to hear you speak. And I'm just doing a lot of study at the moment about startups in Japan, and I'm interested in your comment that you said that Japan really has to deregulate and make it easier for startups. And how do you think, like within the region itself, while the topic is Indo-Pacific, how Japan can better help startups in its region when it cannot really even help its own startups?
That's a great question, and I think that Japan is really thinking about how it can foster startup culture here. But I think in many ways it might be easier for Japan to contribute to startup cultures in other communities because it's not in that that overregulated, Japanese society that is really averse to risk taking. So I think that it might actually be easier to promote innovativeness outside Japan than inside Japan. What can it do in Japan? I think that, in my view, is that we need a fundamental shift at universities where universities are promoting entrepreneurship, innovativeness, how to work with and get opportunities in startups, whether they're startups in Japan or startups, Japanese startups or international startups, because there's a lot in Japan. And infuse that culture of risk-taking. And this is something that I think needs to be done not just at the university level, but the high school level and junior high school level as well. What is risk? What is the appropriate level of risk? And what is the reward associated with that? Second, I think that Japan could do a lot by working with those innovative startup cultures, like I said, in Canada, in Silicon Valley, and Singapore, to see how they're doing it abroad. And the government can set up some packages or programs to create that environment where they can work. They can take the risk and get support from the government in a way that allows them to take the risk that they need to take to be more innovative. Third, I think it's really important that you bring in more migrants, and you have those migrants working side by side with Japanese, so that they can learn to have more outside the box thinking. And Japanese have really good outside the box thinking within Japanese culture, but I think they need outside thinking that fits outside Japanese culture. And that needs to be done through working with people of different cultural backgrounds and linguistic backgrounds. And here I don't just mean Americans, I mean Southeast Asians, South Asians, Middle Easterners, Russians. They all have different thinking, and that needs to be used to kind of spice up how Japanese think about problems and think about risk.
They have the local knowledge too of their own home countries, business structures and business know-how as well. No, thank you very much for that. I think it just solidifies some of the issues that I've been thinking about. It's sometimes not just political that Japan can take an active role in the region. It can be in different layers of business as well. It doesn't necessarily just have to be large corporations, but could be smaller companies that are looking to invest in technologies in the region.
Yeah, and I think there's similar patterns in South Korea as well, because of the dominance of these large conglomerates that really suck up any innovative culture, and they get put into these big conglomerates. And I think that this is an area that Japan needs to think about, how they can create more small and mid-sized businesses that are within the same ecosystem, sitting side by side, that can cross-pollinate in terms of innovativeness and build technologies that are work synergistically with other businesses. And it's interesting, they helped build much of the production network in China over the past 40 years. So it's a kind of a paradox that they can't do it at home as well.
well, sometimes it's easier to fix someone else's home up than your own, right?
Yes.
Yep, that's true.
Maybe it's easier to see that other people's home need repair. It may not be so easy to fix them, but yeah, I see your point, Luke.
Yeah, no, thanks, Stephen. I appreciate the feedback and insight there. Thank you.
My pleasure, Luke.
And Stephen, Ren sent me a link which I shared with everybody, so I think that Ren wants to talk a little bit about this.
Go ahead.
Yeah, hey, thank you, Maya. Thank you, Stefan. I was just reading this just today. It is a fresh report from, people know this, but the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I find it interesting because they are not, in other words, they are not right or left. They are more in the middle of the ground. So it's a long article, but it's worthy of reading, I think, because it touched what Stefan talked about today, especially Japan, US, and China and Taiwan. And from Taiwan's, with the spotlight on Taiwan, and it again, a long report, but one paragraph stayed in my mind. He mentioned that Taiwan's intangible strength is the trust. It's been regarded trusted partner by Japan and the US. So the data Taiwan.
Ren, we cannot hear you very well. I don't know, maybe that's the connection.
Provide international. Let me try to see what I can do. Can you hear me better now, or are you still
yes.
having problem hearing me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Not now. Sorry.
So I think if I get Ren's comment, Taiwan's one of its enduring advantages is its trust, and I think that's also one of Japan's enduring strengths in the Indo-Pacific, and thinking about whether it's the digital economy or otherwise, is it's relatively regarded with trust by the majority of Indo-Pacific stakeholders, and survey after survey shows that. And this is something that I think Japan may be wanting to build upon in terms of its own startup culture, in thinking about supply chains and thinking about how it can engage in trade. Trust is really the precursor to building relationships and engagement. And this may be an area that they can springboard from in terms of learning from Taiwan's experience and its trust, but also trying to use that relationship so that it can deepen its relationships throughout the region.
Right. I changed my Wi-Fi connection. Is it better now? The voice
much
is better?
better, yeah.
Much better.
Okay, good.
Yes. Thank you for doing that.
Thank you. I think this is a very timely report because the supply chain is a major issue for us, right? This is almost like an oil shock in the 1970s. This could be like that. So I guess the ultimate question to Stefan is this. If other countries still do not regard China as a trustworthy partner, the data they provided are not trustworthy and things like that, how can a healthy international, a CPTPP or those platforms even be able to be formed if you have mistrust not been removed in advance? I don't know how that, maybe smart people know how to deal with this, but I just cannot see reasonable people to be able to invite a person into a party when you still do not trust what they say. Or do you think this report is too critical? I'm not sure, but it just doesn't seem to add up to me. But I would like to hear what Stefan has to say.
Yeah, that's this is a sensitive question. So about trust, and I think that when we're speaking about trust, there's different countries that have different levels of trust. So let's think about South Korea. I think South Korea, on many levels, is seen as a trusted partner. But if you ask Japan on security and trade and history, it's not a trusted partner. And if you ask the South Koreans the same about Japan, Japan is not a trusted partner. If you ask China about, let's say, is Japan or the Philippines trusted partners, they will say probably it depends. And I think if you ask most countries in Southeast Asia, is China a trusted partner? They'll tell you that they are an important economic partner for Southeast Asia's development. What they won't tell you in public is that they're constantly trying to find a way to have the benefits of that economic relationship while protecting them from the serious challenges that exist associated with the relationship with China. And I think that's really the answer that is to your question, is how do we engage in China? When we don't trust it. And I think that what we do is we try to create structures or institutions, or we create like Japan. Japan has the U.S.-Japan alliance that has these strategic partnerships, such as the defense treaty with Australia that's probably going to be signed in the next 6 months. And it has all these multilateral relationships. And then Japan engages with China from that position of all those relationships. So I think that while we may not trust China completely, there's areas that are mutually beneficial and synergistic. And I think that there are pockets of trust. And those are the areas that we need to work on.
Well, at the end of the day, everything is perspective. And, there are obviously, historical reasons, cultural reasons for the level of trust each country has towards China and Japan and also other countries in the world as well.
And we can't change our neighbors, right?
No.
The sci-fi shows where Japan, puts some rockets on the Japanese archipelago and moves it to the other side of the planet. Well, that's not going to happen. We know that, right? For the past 5,000 years, they've been neighbors. In the next 5,000 years, they'll be neighbors. So how do you build that relationship? And, I sometimes use the analogy of the Goldilocks position. Not too close, not too far. And that's how Japan, continues to try and develop the relationship with Beijing. Frankly, they're just trying to create as much resilience as possible, because the calculation here is that we're going to have a rough 10 to 15 years, and that Japan needs to build the resilience to be able to withstand that until some of the domestic challenges in China really will push it in a different direction.
Indeed, yes. Ren, I hope that this responds to your comment.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, it's like Stefan said, trust has many different levels. The report in this link talked about the trust of the data it's being provided. So that is another interesting way to say things. Not trusting the person, but the data. We have a international law rule, if you will, and it's a platform, and everybody has to show the data. But if the data is being doubted, then we have a system breakdown. I think that's the point that this report is talking about, and which was a little bit interesting to me. But thank you, Stefan.
Yeah, Ren, that's a really good one. So let me give you an example. So I get asked a lot about the state of the Chinese economy. And you know what I say? I say, well, I generally look at an aggregate level of factors to give me a sense of what is the trajectory of the Chinese economy. So I look at electricity consumption. I look at online consumption. I look at white good consumption. I look at housing investments. I look at investment in education. All of these are, water consumption. How many movies are people going to? And you can get all this data. And individually, these aren't sensitive, right? But when you start to aggregate the data, you go, oh, wow, look at this. We're not seeing really a lot of consumption in expensive things, which suggests that people don't have a lot of money for big ticket items, right? And if you see that electricity consumption is up or down, or that there is problems in these kinds of electricity consumptions or water consumption, this all suggests and gives us ideas about the consumption patterns and the general health of the economy. And this is how we verify the data, right? Or we try to get the clearest picture as possible. Is we use aggregate data to build trust in what the Chinese are telling us, or mistrust. And I think at this particular stage, the aggregate data generally, in most categories, suggests that what we're being told is not what is reality. I must say, and I think using that aggregate data issue, I think one of the areas that the Chinese government probably has been at least the most transparent is their response to COVID after they decided to take charge and put all the resources in a zero approach to COVID in the country. I think they've generally been pretty good, and the aggregate data suggests that their approach has been not perfect. It's problematic, but we haven't seen the waves of deaths like we've seen in other countries. So aggregate data gathering is really the best way we can deal with the trust issue.
Indeed.
Yeah, it's a deep stuff, I think. Yeah,
Very deep.
because the data, you remember the former governor of New York, Cuomo, his data about the death of the people from the COVID was really, really scrutinized. You have the public to really challenge the accuracy of the data. So unless there's a system in China to be able to challenge the accuracy of the data that is provided by the single dominating party, I think this problem probably will not go away for a long time. So I'm a little bit pessimistic, but I think that's the reality we'll face. Like you say, it's a neighbor. It will not go away. We all need some kind of wisdom to see how this goes. The only things I don't want to see happening is what Raymond said a few minutes ago, that the TPP is changed by China. I hope that China will be part of a good citizen, but I'm not too optimistic about it.
Well, I think I wouldn't use the word not optimistic. I think you're realistic. That's somewhat different. But yeah, I think that this is really a big questions, and we saw the WTO, I think, fundamentally changed once China joined. We've seen other examples when China joined the UN and trying to change the UN from within, whether it's our understandings about transparency or the international law and international tribunals, or even the definition of human rights. This is the reality that we need to deal with, and it's the past should be the foundation of how we're thinking about the future, but we need to also not be so deterministic and think that there might be some room for change. But again, that should be based on kind of a aggregate of data to ensure that you're making the best choice possible.
Yeah, the only silver lining maybe is recent clubhouse rooms that I was invited to join. I'm not sure you know this, or maybe you knew this already, Stefan, but there are actually a lot of overseas Chinese who are trying to tell the truth about what's really happening in China, and I don't think they're exaggerating. And they are really trying to see if they are hoping China their beloved motherland can be on the trusted side of the international communities, and maybe that's a silver lining, which may go back to what you said: education, international students exchange is important.
Yes, the more they learn, the more we learn about their society and their language and their culture, and vice versa, is really critical to, I think, creating and coexisting more peacefully. I think the challenge is that you may be interested in this. You can just Google it up, Document 9. And there is quite a famous politician called Wang Hunin, and he's kind of the theoretical thinker behind Document 9 and China Dream and Community of Common Destiny. And it's very pessimistic, but the view amongst the party is that they need to crush civil society, rule of law, constitutionalism, freedom of press, civil society to protect the one-party state. So it's worth reading if you have time. Again, it's called Document 9, and the theoretician is Wang Hunin, and there's a great podcast on Sinica that talks all about him. I encourage you to take a listen.
Is he still alive?
Yes, he's still alive. He's I think he's in the standing committee of the Politburo, and he plays a major role in shaping Chinese ideology.
Interesting.
Send me a LinkedIn message. I can send you a whole list of the links.
Okay, great. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Yeah, if I can jump in a little bit.
Sure, Raymond.
Yeah, so I think I to share I think Ren Yugawa-san, okay, his sentiment, because it seems to be like what Stephen you have just mentioned about one of the fundamental reasons why China has submitted its application to the CPTPP is to block Taiwan from becoming a member, right?
Mm-hmm.
If I understand this correctly. So in this sense, I think it seems to me Beijing does have the ulterior motive behind its application for the CPTPP, and so in this sense, I think it is hard not for other members or neighbors, right, to be skeptical about China's motivation in joining. And like you said, this kind of trust, I think it may take some additional efforts for the Chinese government to build up or to restore this, like I said, this level of trust between Beijing and the neighboring countries. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I really, I really think, and probably my last few comments for tonight, but it's really important for us to disaggregate trust. And if you look at the Afrobarometer, and you can just look
Right.
this up, Afrobarometer. And Raymond, you do a lot of the Africa stuff, but
Right,
you see
right.
China has higher trust there, right?
Generally speaking, yes.
Yeah, and it suggests that the views of China in one part of the world are very different than views of China in another part of the world, and there's a lot of reasons for that. But I think it's important for us to reflect upon that, because it suggests that not as all golden, but not as all coal, right? And I think that we need to always be aware of the variety of views about China, and it's not seen as in some places it's seen as a champion of the emerging world, where in other parts of the world it's seen as trying to take over the world. It's probably somewhere in between.
Yeah, Stephen, and Raymond, for the benefit of the people in this room, I think most of us are not on that part of the world to be comfortable with the way that China is dealing with, let's say, Senkaku Island, for example, all these kind of stuff. Maybe you can share with maybe one example of that part of the world and what China did that was beneficial. I'm not saying this in a sarcastic way, but really beneficial for that particular region of the country that is earning the trust from the people in that country. Because we are probably a little bit far away from that kind of experience, right? So I think there's a benefit of introducing one example, if you know one.
Okay, I'm just pulling up something on my screen here. Just a second. That's not the one. Just a second. It's actually something that I spoke at for the Shanghai Academy of Social Sciences a few weeks ago. So this is, okay, it's from the Afrobarometer 2021. And basically this is a large-scale survey of all the African countries, and they usually survey and ask them specific questions. So one of the questions was, what's the best model for development? And this was asked to 18 countries, 2019 to 2020. And the United States came on top at 32%, and China was 23%. So 23% of the countries surveyed viewed China as a positive model in terms of development. And this is another survey question was perceived positive influence of China. And yeah, you can see that countries like Gabon Verde, Guinea, Mali, Burkina Faso, Cote d'Ivoire, Kenya. Kenya has gone down, but the first 4 or 5 countries I mentioned are 85%, 80%, 80% is high. So I assume that this has something to do with Belt Road Initiative projects and development assistance in these countries, and that they're usually not tied to requests about changing your governance or changing your political system or advocating for human rights or progressive issues. And for these countries that were former colonial states, this is something that I think they appreciate. What do you think, Raymond?
Yeah, I think, like what I've just said also, Stephen, you have also mentioned about this level of trust in this part of the world, like on the African continent, over China is generally higher than the other parts of the world.
Yeah.
But it seems like even say for the past few years, I think probably what we're witnessing here is also the declining level of trust, or the declining level of positive reception of the China's Belt and Road Initiative, even in those countries in Africa. And so I'm not sure if this so-called China's model of economic development is still proved to be that appealing when it was first launched in 2013. Because as we can see, quite a number of examples showing or showcasing that, say, I think if I'm not wrong, okay, I think I've just read the news relating to the potential takeover of the only international airport of Uganda by the Chinese government yesterday. Yeah, so it seems to me, or also for many other observers, that this is probably another example of so-called debt trap diplomacy of China, following the Hambantota example in Sri Lanka. So I think that potentially this can be quite a worrying development in terms of China's efforts, okay, to again to subtly promote its model of development, especially this signature foreign policy known as the Belt and Road Initiative in the long run. Yeah, that's kind of a worrying development, in my opinion. But what do you think, Stephen?
Yeah, I agree. I think that we have to be really thinking about this in terms of, Africa's a huge place, right?
Right.
And it's really difficult to say one thing about China in Africa because it represents, it's such a huge place.
Diverse and
It's just like saying Asia. What is Asia? Where does it start? Where does it end?
Exactly.
What is the different economic relationships that exist there? And I think it's just it's too hard to say. And I think even if you broke Africa down into, let's say, Northeast Africa, East Africa, Southeast Africa, Southwest Africa, you'd probably get a different view as well.
Right.
Well, thank you for that. So, Stephen, we're way past 9:30, so I wonder if we have exhausted the questions. Probably we can close the room and get ready for the next one in 2 weeks. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's good. Let me say thanks to Ren and Hiroaki and Raymond and Luke for their engagement and thoughtful questions, and really making this an enriching dialogue. And of course, our host Maya.
No, thank you, Stephen, and thank you, Ren, Hiroaki, Raymond, and also Luke, of course. Also, Lynn.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephen. This was Japan Expert Insights on geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific and Japan's role in the region. Thank you for coming and staying with us today. We will be on air in 2 weeks on Monday at 8:30 p.m. Japan time again, so join us. Until then, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel, where we upload audio episodes on Japanese politics, business insights, and the role of Japan in the Indo-Pacific region. If you want to stay informed about our upcoming events, you can follow us on Clubhouse, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. Again, we are looking forward to your joining us next week. Until then, stay well and make every day count. See you.